So maybe I'll start with it's the end of the world as we know it, but soft landings are possible. I don't know how many of you feel, but when I look at our country and the world, I see lots of reasons for hope, and I also see lots of challenges. And it seems to me what I've been writing about are some of the major challenges have to do with 4 or 5 particular areas, including one that is the topic for tonight. But the other ones that I talk about, and I think it might be good to keep in mind, one of them is the issue of inequality, just how unequal our nation is and how unequal the world is. We have this huge, incredible gap that separates the rich from the poor. And that is not sustainable. It's not sustainable morally, socially, or even ecologically. So that's an issue that for me is a challenge that I think that we need to face. A second one, which is oftentimes controversial to talk about, is that I think it's also the end of the world in terms of the United States believing that it can exercise military power in ways that actually bring about positive change. And that way more often than not, U.S. military engagement is actually fostering and creating more problems that it's solving. And if we're looking to solve the problem of climate change, for example, we're going to have a major shift in our nation's use of human and financial resources away from war. Just one example figure I have in my head is China, which we all hear that we should be fearing. It spends twice as much on its military as it does on addressing climate change. So they have a 2-to-1 ratio spending on military versus climate. The ratio of the United States is 25-to-1. So that's another really pressing issue that intersects with how do we move forward if we're going to address the issue of climate. And then a third kind of related concern for me that intersects with the topic tonight of climate is how dysfunctional our political system has become and how much it is driven by moneyed interests. And my wife, Sarah, tonight heard a report on public radio that apparently the Senate passed a resolution today saying that climate change doesn't exist. And I pointed out a few years ago the U.S. House of Representatives voted on a simple resolution. All it said was climate change is happening, it's caused largely by human action, and that it's a serious public health issue. And one Republican voted for that, and it was resoundingly defeated. So we have a political challenge before us if we're going to address climate. And this is a challenge that impacts both Democrats and Republicans, but it's particularly problematic that one of the major parties in the country kind of refuses to acknowledge the seriousness of the problem. So let's move on then to what I see as this fourth great challenge, which is the topic for tonight, which is addressing the climate crisis and global warming. I think we owe a real debt of gratitude to Pope Francis. So I'm speaking as a non-Catholic who teaches justice and peace studies at a Catholic university, who has oftentimes been quite upset about some of the things that popes do. And this pope isn't perfect from my vantage point, but we owe him a real debt of gratitude in terms of the timing of the release of this encyclical. And it was not a coincidence that he released this encyclical, realizing that a number of months later the world would gather, and it was a push to politicians around the world to do something, to try to take meaningful action. And what came out of that international conference itself is not perfect. I'll say a little bit about that maybe at the end. But I don't think that we would have gotten to any kind of agreement really had it not been for the push that is connected to this encyclical that I'm going to summarize for you tonight. So let me start out with a quote that I really like from his encyclical. And in this, he describes the purpose of releasing the encyclical. He says, "Our goal is not to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to become painfully aware." That in itself is powerful. Our goal is to help us, the goal of this encyclical is to help us become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. So in other words, the Pope in this encyclical wasn't simply trying to inform, he was really encouraging each of us to take very seriously our grave responsibilities for both the crisis that exists, but also for moving beyond that crisis. So what I've done, I've spent a lot of time with this encyclical over the last 9 months or so. So I've divided it into 14 themes that are kind of centrally featured. And I'm not going to give you an hour lecture on each theme, but I am going to mention each theme because I think you'll get a better sense of the depth and breadth of the Pope's understanding of what's at stake in the climate issue. So, theme number 1. He starts with what I call a confession of plunder. So his starting point for this document is confession. And he says, quote, "The Sister Earth now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will." So it's a pretty strong beginning point. And yet the Pope, like myself, in terms of that writing that I've done on authentic hope, would say there really is a lot of reasons for hope, but there's no likelihood of hope actually being embodied unless we face problems honestly. Right? So his starting point for us to think about is that this incredible earth, this incredible gift, is right now being plundered by human beings in terms of how we relate to that earth. Okay, the second theme is a call for universal dialogue. Universal dialogue, meaning a dialogue of all of us, and about our responsibility to take action in order to create a better future. So again, this is a direct quote. He says, this is ambitious. "I wish to address every living person on this planet." All right? It's not for Joel, it's not for me, it's not for the people in this room, it's not for people in the US. It's for each living person on the planet. Which again is a not too subtle way of the Pope saying, this is really urgent. This is something that we all need to pay attention to and that we're all responsible for. He says, "I want to bring the whole human family together to seek a sustainable and integral development. It is my hope," he writes, "that this encyclical letter can help us to acknowledge the appeal, immensity, and urgency of the challenge we face." So the second theme is that we're all included. It's addressed to all of us because the issue is so important that it is going to require all of us to find pathways forward. All right, the third theme, which I am sure is upsetting to climate change deniers. His third theme is that he doesn't debate the science. He says the ecological climate crisis is simply the starting point for this conversation. The science, he says, is clear. There is no debate about the science. The Pope doesn't debate the science. He accepts the science and says the science of the climate change is so compelling that it too is our starting point. So he accepts, quote, a very solid scientific consensus on climate change. Okay. He notes, he says, the church does not presume to settle scientific questions or to replace politics, but he says, I am concerned to encourage an honest and open debate so that particular interests or ideologies will not prejudice the common good. Now that's a punch in the stomach to those who let ideology trump facts, right? And that's a huge problem in our country. In terms of taking meaningful action, it should be sobering to all of us to realize that we still have a great deal of denial about a scientific consensus. 98% of the world's climate scientists are in agreement. So I think it's actually really smart of the Pope, and also says a lot that he's just saying the scientific consensus is there. We're not going to debate that. That's the starting point for the crisis that we need to face as human beings. Okay, the fourth theme is, he says, that there are, if you just open your eyes, there are many, 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 many disturbing signs of this deep ecological crisis of which climate change is one important manifestation. So he says, the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. And then he just cites some of the evidence that if we just open our eyes, we'll see. Species extinctions, the melting ice caps, methane gas releases, sea level rises, human migration, water pollution, deforestation, agricultural monocultures, industrial waste, ocean acidification, and he lists many others. So again, for the Pope and for this encyclical, and for the purpose of trying to have a conversation with everyone, he's really suggesting that the starting point for that conversation, if we open our eyes, is simply to see all of the signs that point to the fact that we as human beings are living in a critical moment because of our disconnect with ecology, again, of which climate change is a real clear example. He says, if present trends continue, this century may well witness extraordinary climate changes and an unprecedented destruction of ecosystems with serious consequences for all of us. All right, a fifth theme from the encyclical is that ecological destruction is a consequence of human arrogance, which is sinful. So destroying the earth is sin. It's very, very clear. He was writing this document for everyone, and so there are areas in the encyclical where he talks specifically about theology, and some of it's Catholic theology that is beyond me. But for the most part, he's writing literally to all of us, and he's not asking us to embrace too much of the Catholic faith, but he is saying that the ecological destruction of which climate change is a manifestation is a consequence of sin. So he quotes Patriarch Bartholomew, "For human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, to contaminate the earth's waters, its land, its air, and its life, these are sins. And he calls for a fundamental change in how we are relating to the earth. Now, I suspect, I teach at a Catholic university, the University of St. Thomas. It is many, many things, but it is largely, I would say, still fundamentally a business school, where the vast majority of students' majors are in business. And I think the challenges that the Pope lays out in this document really do touch all of us. But the people who should be the most uncomfortable with the Pope's message are economists and business people. For the simple reason that his sixth theme is very, very clear, and he spends more time on this issue than any other issue in this encyclical, and that is that the ecological climate crisis is the result of flawed economic systems, flawed economic assumptions, and flawed economic values. Now that's a biggie. That's a biggie, because what the Pope is suggesting is that we should not be surprised by these crises, because embedded in our economic logic, values, and systems are assumptions that just are wrong. And one of those assumptions is that you can grow your way out of this crisis, or that you can grow your way out of the crisis of poverty. The assumption that the planet, on a finite planet, that unlimited economic growth is at all realistic is just not realistic. Is what the Pope says. And he uses very strong language. He says, economic powers continue to justify the current global system where priority tends to be given to speculation and the pursuit of financial gain. As a result, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interests of a deified market, which becomes the only rule. The Pope has consistently written and spoken about this, not beyond this encyclical, of saying that what we have done is we have turned the market into a god. And in some of his language, not in this encyclical but elsewhere, he says, and this is not quite a direct quote, but you'll get the idea, he says, just as the commandment says, thou shalt not kill, he says, thou shalt not kill through economic mechanisms. I mean, the language that he uses could not be stronger. So he says also, we all know, I wish that were true, we all know that it is not possible to sustain the present level of consumption in developed countries and wealthier sectors of society where the habit of wasting and discarding has reached unprecedented levels. He says it's easy to accept the idea of infinite or unlimited growth, which proves so attractive to economists, financiers, and experts in technology. It is based on the lie that there is an infinite supply of the Earth's goods, and this leads to the planet being squeezed dry beyond every limit. Pretty strong language. So his seventh theme, drawing on or following this theme that we have a problem rooted in the economy itself, the way that we have organized economics. He goes on to say what we need, if we're going to change, is a profound transformation of politics. And as someone who teaches justice and peace studies, one of the things that I really encourage our students to think about on multiple levels is to examine power dynamics and differentials in power. Because what ends up happening so many times is those that are defining problems oftentimes in ways that let them off the hook in terms of somehow they're distant from the problem. And if they're powerful enough, then they can frame solutions that don't really get to solutions, but in fact end up protecting the interests that are at the heart of the problem in the first place? Well, it's unusual in my experience for people in the church, especially leadership levels at that level of the Pope, to say we have to address and see the unequal power relationships that are at the heart of these dysfunctional economic systems. So he says, many of those who possess more resources and economic or political power seem mostly to be concerned with masking the problems or concealing their symptoms, simply making efforts to reduce some of the negative impacts. He says there are too many special interests and economic interests. They easily end up trumping the common good in manipulating information so that their own plans will not be affected. So theme 7 then is we need a transformed politics, and we need a politics that will be willing to address power issues. And of course, in our present political climate, one of the issues that is being raised, at least by one of the candidates in a fairly profound way, and that was also at the heart of the Occupy movement, is very consistent with what the Pope is saying here. That when you have incredible gaps between the rich and the poor, you also have that gap translating into political power. Money translates into political power and influence that perpetuates that system. Now, the Pope doesn't mention these figures, but I will. In the United States, if you were to divide wealth by quintile, so 20%, 20%, 20%, the richest 20% in the United States have 84% of the nation's wealth. Okay? The next quintile has 11%. The third quintile has 4%. The bottom 40% of the U.S. population has less than 0.2% of the nation's wealth. Now I'll say that again. The bottom 40% of the U.S. population has less than 0.2% of the nation's wealth. And what the Pope is saying here is that that dysfunctional economy, again, which is distributing benefits so unequally, also translates into dysfunctional political power, and that those dysfunctional systems need to be addressed if we're going to address climate change. He calls on politicians to adopt true statecraft. He calls on them to step away from ideological blinders. He calls for them to be bold. He is very much aware that we have a pretty dysfunctional political system at play. Okay, an eighth theme in this encyclical is that the ecological climate problems reflect a profound crisis of meaning and values. And for the Pope, and I would say for me in my writing, I would say this too. I think that there's a temptation that maybe many of us have, some of us have, I know certainly I have it, of wanting to examine this problem or the related problems to climate and think, well, we just need to come up with a new technological fix. You know, the scientists are going to save us. They're going to invent something. We're going to be able to make some discoveries that will allow us to clean this up in time. And what the Pope is suggesting is that these problems of our ecological, or our disconnect between what is sustainable and the ecology, and the dysfunctional priorities that lead to climate change, that all of those reflect in a very, very direct way distorted values. So a simple way that I talk about this is we're not likely to get to better policies unless we reassess the values that are behind present policies. And again, some of those values have to do with power, they have to do with profit, they have to do with greed, they have to do with the deification of the market, There's not a lot of compassion. There's not enough empathy. There's not enough, the Pope would say, joy. There's not enough mindfulness in terms of just being fully aware of the miracle of each day. So this is a little more subtle, but the Pope is suggesting here that the transformation that we need is deeper than simply technological fixes. And I think it's a great temptation to suggest that that yes, this is a serious problem, but we're going to technologically fix it, instead of looking deeper at the deep cultural norms and values that are at play right now. You couldn't have a more bitter, dysfunctional two-party system right now than we have. And that's not going to be transformed by a technological fix. The assessment is going to have to be, or the changes are going to have to be deeper. And I think those of us who do come out of faith traditions, that's something where we have a real opportunity as well as responsibility. The way I sometimes say this in my writing is I say, I think a transition is possible in which we can improve quality of life for present and future generations while dramatically lessening our ecological footprints. That's our challenge, and I really do believe that that's possible, that we can improve quality of life for present and future generations while being responsible in terms of how we relate to the earth. But I think that possibility is really rooted in rethinking the purpose of economics. And my way of saying this is, in the future, the purpose of an economy is going to need to be to provide the material foundation for meaning-based societies. I'll say that one more time, that the purpose of an economy is to provide a material foundation, the food, the shelter, the other things that we need. That foundation is essential for meaning-based societies. And I think that is very much in line with what the Pope is suggesting in this encyclical. Okay, a ninth theme that again, I really appreciate is the Pope is making a direct connection between the exploitation of people and the exploitation of the earth. So for the Pope, the fact that we have economic systems that are leaving billions of people out and billions of people living in poverty or marginalized lives is directly related to the same values and same systems that are destroying the earth, the water, the air, the climate. So for the Pope, this is not two separate problems. Poverty on the one hand is issue one and the climate is two. For the Pope, this is one related issue. And I think that connection is a really vital one to make. He says, we are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. He says, strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. All right, theme number 10. Is the importance of educating for social transformation. It gets at that first quote that I read to you starting out from his encyclical. Now I teach in a liberal arts environment, and I will forever be a defender of trying to keep education from being completely overtaken by corporations and viewing education simply as how can we provide the workforce for the corporations. Liberal arts education is, from my vantage point, part of that deeper cultural change that needs to take place. And for the Pope, he is suggesting, again, that yes, education probably of all kinds is valuable, but what we really need is we need education for transformation. We need, and this is what I try to do. This is my vocation, right? I teach justice and peace studies. I teach with young people at the University of St. Thomas. And my goal through education is to have young people recognize their responsibility and their power, and to increase their capacity for transforming unjust situations into greater justice and peace. And that's a vital, vital, vital goal that I believe should be at the heart of education. Parenthetically, Sarah and I lived in Central America for a number of years during the U.S.-sponsored wars in the 1980s, and we lived in Nicaragua, but I spent quite a time in El Salvador. And I got to know a number of the Jesuit priests in El Salvador that ran the Catholic University there. You may remember that 6 of them were brutally murdered in November 1989 by graduates of a U.S. military training school. And they were murdered because of their vision of the university. And in essence, when I met with them, what they would say is, most universities invite students to come in and they say, come to our university because we're going to help you succeed. And implicit in that invitation is, we're going to help you succeed even in an unjust world. And what the Jesuits were trying to do is they said, our vision of the university is we're trying to invite students in and we're saying, come to our university and we're going to help give you the skills to transform an unjust world. And I think the Pope is really laying out an educational challenge to all of us, but especially for those of us who deal with young people in education, that education needs to be about transformation. And that's not just providing knowledge. I think it's about providing inspiration and providing young people with both a sense of possibility and some skills linked to unleashing their capacity to dream and envision a different kind of world. So that's theme number 10, is that education is for social transformation. Theme number 11, I kind of already touched on, so I'm just going to mention this one, is he says, this is a time for courageous leadership. And that's not just political leadership, it's wherever we are. Whoever we work with, whatever our workplace, whether it's in private business, whether it's within education, we all need to be taking the climate issue seriously and figuring out what role can I play in terms of changing or influencing my own behavior, but also mobilizing others to work for the changes that are needed. So there are implications for all of us to claim and build on leadership in ways that don't see our response to the climate crisis simply as an individual response, but we all have responsibilities in the public realm as well. All right, you can tell by my numbers I'm getting closer. So theme number 12 is the need to reject war and violence and to promote peace. Now, the Pope has actually been stronger on this outside of this encyclical, but he does include it in this encyclical. I actually wish it would have been a little stronger within this encyclical, but it's there. He talks about how depleting resources may be followed by additional wars. He says, albeit under the guise of noble claims. Well, who do you suppose that's directed to, right? That's probably directed directly to our nation. It says, war always does grave harm to the environment and to the cultural riches of peoples. He says, peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are 3 absolutely interconnected themes. They cannot be separated and treated individually. So, we need to reject war. Now again, I gave you the ratios. We spend 25 times more on militarism and war than we spend on climate. And arguably, a far graver threat to the future then ISIS is climate. And we need to be thinking about that. And then 13th theme is he calls for, and this is right out of liberation theology for any of you who are familiar with that, but a preferential option for the poor and intergenerational solidarity. And what he means, of course, preferential option for the poor means we need to be making decisions that really address hunger, poverty, and inequality, and that should be a priority in our policy making. But the other one, intergenerational solidarity, is really directed at we cannot morally justify not taking action on climate and imposing this on future generations, imposing this on young people, imposing the problems on people yet to be born. So intergenerational solidarity is one of the themes. And then the 14th theme is that solutions are possible and they require changes at multiple levels. They require changes at multiple levels. So he says we are going to need international agreements to take on this issue. He talks about how we will need, but he says in the absence of international agreements, every nation has a moral and ethical responsibility to take action for its policies now. Because what we have seen in this country for decades is the U.S. being an anchor, dragging down international efforts around this issue. And oftentimes the justification being, well, if China or India won't do anything, we're not going to do anything, right? And the Pope just takes that directly on and says, every nation, every national leader has a responsibility to take national actions. But it's not just national actions. And here I think we can feel pretty good in Minnesota. Minnesota has some of the best policies at a state level of any state in the country in terms of addressing climate change. And there's still more things to be done, but change needs to take place at that level. Change needs to take place at the individual level. But the Pope is very clear. He says, we all should be responsible for taking action as individuals to address this problem, but taking individual action and even adding all individual actions up, that's not enough. We need to be engaged in the public arena. So and I really also appreciate this about the Pope, is he is very clear about the dysfunction of our political system. Not just in this country, but probably elsewhere, but I think more pronounced here. And he's saying, really, the only way of getting national leaders to do what they should do about this issue, to do the many things that they should be doing, is if there are grassroots movements of people demanding those changes. So he's very, very supportive of the mobilization of people at a grassroots level and the need to do that, because politicians aren't going to do the right thing simply because we want them to do the right thing, because they have entrenched interests and money interests who are encouraging them to not do the right thing. But he doesn't let us off the hook as citizens. It's our responsibility as citizens within an environment in which national leadership is reluctant at best and pathetic oftentimes. That's not a reason for us to wash our hands. It's a reason for us to roll up our sleeves. So those are the 14 themes. I want to touch on one huge blind spot in the document, because I don't want to just convey, wow, the Pope has got it all right and he's wonderful and that's great, and without acknowledging. And the big blind spot, not too surprising, is population. The Pope acknowledges in this document that other species have value in and of themselves apart from their usefulness to humanity. That's a step in the right direction. But he is completely unwilling to address the issue of how population growth is encroaching on habitats all over the place. And of course, he's very good about overconsumption being a major cause. But here's a case, in my view, where Catholic dogma stands in the way of actually looking at a problem in a way that it needs to be looked at. So the Pope himself is not immune from that danger or that temptation. Let me close my part, and I want to open up and hear your questions. But I will say just a few words about the international agreement that was reached in Paris and how I feel about that. So I haven't talked publicly about how I feel about it much. So, Jack, how do you feel about this agreement? First of all, it's really important that there was an agreement and that 185 or more nations decided to set and say that 2 degree Celsius level that the countries had said, we've got to keep global warming below 2 degrees centigrade if we're going to have a reasonable chance of avoiding catastrophic climate change. That number was reinforced in Paris, and all these countries were on record not only of staying below that threshold, but they actually said that what they need to aspire to is to keep the temperature rise at 1.5 instead of 2. So they actually, now that's aspirational, right? There's no practical strategy for keeping it there. We're far from that. But they're on record as saying, all these nations that signed on are on record saying we are going to keep the temperature warming below the warming of 2 degrees centigrade, and we're going to try to keep it below 1.5. That's probably the most, in some ways, the most important thing to come out of the agreement. Because what it does is it gives scientists and citizens who pay attention to the science, it gives us an organizing handle to say to our leaders, if you develop the Arctic as an area for oil exploration, you are not going to stay at 2 degrees. If you approve the Keystone Pipeline, you are not going to limit carbon emissions below 2 degrees centigrade. You're just not going to do it. So that was one very important thing that came out. A second thing that is in the agreement, again, still with a lot of details to be worked out, was the idea that those nations that have put the most carbon in the atmosphere and caused more of the problem are responsible for taking deep action, and they are also responsible for helping pay for the transition away from carbon fuels for poorer countries. The U.S. tried to put a brake on a lot of that, but the language is still there, and that's an important feature as well. So I think, my job was to tell you what the Pope said, and I interjected myself here and there, but I would happily entertain questions and comments. What time are we at? Do we have?
About 15 minutes.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes, and Carol has a microphone that she'll pass around to, so everybody can hear the questions.
Carol? Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious, yes, it's sticking in my ear. What happens next? The Pope said this is his encyclical, but what's the framework that makes anything happen because he said it?
Yeah. So he said it's very nice that the Pope said these things, but what's the next step, and how does it translate from the Pope saying something to actual action? Well, a lot of that depends upon us as people, and certainly it depends on people in the Catholic Church and elsewhere to make the ideas in this document, to bring it to public like we're doing in a forum even like tonight. So for me, the existence of this very strong document it's a vehicle for those of us who care profoundly about this issue to reach out to others in a conversation. So it's a piece of paper, but it's a piece of paper that if we use it, can open up a conversation and a debate. Second, I think, value related to this is that we do have to face the problem that one of the two major political parties in this country are committed to climate change denial and trying to undo this agreement. Now again, economist Paul Krugman wrote a column about a month ago in which he said, what the election really should be about is that if the Republicans win, they're going to destroy the planet. He said, I being accused of being partisan. He says, I'm not being partisan, I'm being realistic about what the implications are when one of the political parties is denying. Well, the fact that you have lots of Republicans that are also Christian, the existence of this document allows, again, to push a conversation about ideology and about the science and all of those things. So I think it's up to us to use it. The third thing I would say is that I think, as I started out, that this document already had an impact. I think it played a very significant role in creating a climate in Paris in which the countries could not walk away without doing something. And I think what they would have done would have been much less had it not been for the existence of this document and kind of the pressure. Now we should also know, and give the Pope credit for this too, the US and Cuba have improved relationships largely because of the role that was played by Pope Francis. The US and the Iranian deal over nuclear stuff, the Pope played a major role in that. So there is a track record of this Pope's voice actually making a difference, and I think that's particularly important for us to magnify that voice.
Emily, we talk about what individuals can do, and it really rests with us. That's hard to see, but and I'm sure everybody else, gets tremendous amounts of mail from one organization or another, and many of these have a letter that you should sign, a petition, to Obama or our representatives or whatever, about mining or this and that.
Yeah.
Please sign this and send it in with a contribution.
Yeah.
Now, do you think there is any usefulness in that?
Some. I teach a class on public policy analysis and advocacy. And the general rule of thumb is if you really want to communicate with legislators, the best way to do that is personal visits and personal phone calls. It's okay to send a mass email or sign on, but it has far less impact than taking the time to actually write a letter or make a phone call or do a personal visit. So there's nothing wrong with signing on to those that you believe in. And in many cases, if you're able to send a contribution to groups that are working on the variety of issues that groups are working on, I think the only danger is when we feel that level of engagement and action is all we need to do. So if it creates the illusion that we're going to solve this problem through just responding to our emails, that's probably not true. Now, I will say, at the level of Minnesota, there are a lot of really good environmental groups that have been engaging in this issue effectively. And one of the ones I like a lot is the group Fresh Energy. And one of the things about Fresh Energy, it's a regional group, and it works on renewable energy issues and specifically addressing climate. so that we have, again, some of the best legislation in the country. But the way that Fresh Energy works is before every, and they work at a state level, but so before every state legislation or legislative session starts, they pull together about 50 environmental organizations and decide what are the 3 issues they're going to focus on. What are the 3 most important issues that they're all going to agree that they're going to work on. Doesn't mean they can't work on something else, but it means you've got 50 or 30 or whatever it is that are focused on winning on some specific measures. That kind of organizing is much more effective. I'll tell you one small thing that my faith community does, and Ken and Carol Masters have been part of this, is we as a community, some of our members, we decided that we really need a carbon tax in this country. And what we always hear is that, well, politicians can't talk about a carbon tax because if they would talk about it, they would never get elected. And so we decided to impose a tax on ourselves. So every time that we buy a gallon of gas, Sarah and I pay a $2 tax per gallon. And we keep track of that each quarter of the year. And other members of our community do that as well. And each quarter then we pool that money and we give that money to local and other organizations that are working on renewable energy, alternative transit, climate change, a whole bunch of different things. So what I'm saying is I think that there are multiple ways that we can act. It's not a bad thing to sign on to those, but it's probably not sufficient.
1 or 2 more, Meg?
No, I was wondering.
Two questions. Individually, my sense is that we're electing the wrong people. And so I've often thought, or I'm wondering what your thoughts are, that voter registration in poor areas of the city, where you can bring people and encourage them to vote for politicians that are going to represent their best interests as well as ours, is one of the most effective things that individual can do to move this process along.
Yeah.
My second question is...
Well, I'll just quickly respond to that one. I think to mobilize people to vote, and to do that in communities that tend to be marginalized and tend not to vote is really vital. And I would also say that we should be aware, again, that one of the political parties is engaged in a very, very, very determined and active program to not deny the right to vote to many, many, many people. And that should be, I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, that should trouble us.
And briefly, my second, your sense of the population of St. Thomas, is the next generation going to save us?
Well, it's really interesting. I've been at St. Thomas now for about 20 years. I am more hopeful about what I see at the university than I've ever been. And that's because there's new leadership at all kinds of levels, and the leadership that's there, I think, really, really cares about issues of hunger and poverty and inequality, peace, justice, take Catholic social teaching very, very seriously, want the school to be known as more than a business school. So at that level, things are very encouraging. And then I think young people who are coming in I think they're aware that things aren't going very well. And I think that the challenge then is to reach them in ways that help them navigate that and find positive ways of contributing. And so I think the student body is more open and interested, and certainly, I don't know how people in this room feel about these issues, but it's very interesting to see at a conservative Catholic university, students couldn't care at all about your choice of sexual partner. in terms of whether it's men loving men or women loving women. That's just a non-issue for young people. I think that's a hopeful thing. I think concern about the environment is deeper and deeper each year. And I also think that students are longing, many of them at least, are really longing for meaning and finding ways, and meaning to be found in their lives somehow intersecting with things that matter. And I think that that's very hopeful. And if you look at, again, I'm very critical of Democrats and Republicans, even though I ran as a Democrat. But I will say I find it really intriguing that young people overwhelmingly are supporting Bernie Sanders. That's very interesting. And he's talking about, he's talking about breaking up, the power bases of a society that's pretty dysfunctional. I think that's actually pretty hopeful. So maybe one more you have time for? Carol's my guide here, so.
Well, there's two levels that each of us can respond in a way about this, and I think it's all pretty clear that with politics and activity, that's clearly one avenue. I'm at a loss on a personal level when I meet someone who is a denier to say something that they can hear. And I say this because this is my conversation with my brother.
Yeah.
And saying 99 or 98% of the scientists support climate change, and it doesn't mean a thing to him.
Yeah. Well, then, I think there's some people are going to be maybe impossible to reach. I don't have a magic conversation starter. But I will say that there are many, many benefits of moving the economy in a cleaner energy direction. It's not just about climate. If you have anyone in your family with asthma, there's so many downsides to coal, for example, that are related to health-related issues, that maybe that's a handle. I think you can make the argument that if the United States wants to be a leading economic power, if you're going to try to do that with oil and coal, you're going to be way behind. That isn't the future. And so I think there are other ways of engaging in a conversation where you can say, okay, well, maybe you don't, maybe you will never accept the science. So let's just look at some of the other benefits of moving in a different direction.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and appreciate you being here.